The Stono Rebellion was the largest slave revolt in southern British America. Led by an Angolan male slave named Jemmy Cato, it took place in 1739 in the colony of South Carolina. Welcome to Black British Hub, where I explore histories of the racialized peoples of Britain and the British Empire. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and keep notified. By the early 18th century, most of South Carolina's population were enslaved Africans, and slave labor was central to the colony of South Carolina's economy. Their slave policies were directly influenced by the slave policies enforced in British-occupied Barbados, as many planters in the nation migrated to Carolina. Parliamentary lords in the 17th century had established the Federal Constitution of Carolina, which granted African slavery to be based on the West Indian model. The Lords Proprietors also offered prospective Carolina settlers 20 acres of land during the first year of settlement for every black male they owned, and 10 acres for every black female. Additionally, they had brought enslaved Africans from Barbados and some other parts of the West Indies to Carolina, and they became Carolina's main source of enslaved labor. In 1691, Carolina's leaders established a slave code that was almost the same as laws passed in 1661 to 1668 in Barbados. This code served to legally define enslaved Africans as chattel property in Carolina. Because the vast majority of the population were enslaved Africans, and there had been news about slave revolts that happened in the Caribbean, this heightened fears of a similar slave rebellion in Carolina, so the settlers took it upon themselves to enforce very strict and violent laws for Africans in the colony. At the same time, these violent laws would serve as one of the reasons why the Stono Rebellion happened. Some enslaved Africans had heard about other enslaved Africans that ran away to Florida, which was under Spanish occupation at the time. Because there was always competition between colonial powers, the Spanish would grant freedom and land to any runaway to agitate the British. This became the main cause of the Stono Rebellion. But how could these slaves possibly have known that freedom and land was guaranteed in Spanish Florida? Well, we have to look at the origins of many of these enslaved peoples, especially the leader and his band. Many enslaved Africans, men and women who took part in the revolt, came from the Kingdom of Congo. The Portuguese already had their presence, and many Congo citizens converted to Catholicism, whether forced or not. Thus, Catholicism became part of their identity, where they felt connected to the Vatican, additionally due to Portuguese-Congo relations. Many Congo peoples also learned to speak Portuguese, with some learning to read and write in the language. Since Spanish is a language with many similarities and also identifies with Catholicism, this enabled enslaved Congo peoples in South Carolina to understand thoroughly on the policies of Spanish Florida and the rights of a runaway slave from the British American colonies. As a result, this led to the sole goal of the Stono Rebellion, which was to escape to Spanish Florida. Between the Stono River, where the rebellion began, and Florida, there was 150 miles or 240 kilometers. However, there was an obstacle. Georgia sits between South Carolina and Florida. It was an all-white colony without any slavery at the time, and worked with South Carolina to try and prevent any fugitives to Florida. Another cause of the rebellion was a malaria epidemic that killed whites in Charleston, which weakened the power of white slaveholders, and malaria in general has been a problem in South Carolina for multiple years, even in modern times. There is very little information on who Jemmy was. He was also known as Cato, and the Stono Rebellion is also known as Cato's Rebellion. Cato derived from the Cato family, whom he was likely held by. He came from the Kingdom of Congo, in which most of the area is now part of modern-day Angola, although small parts of it were eventually succeeded to both of the Congolese countries today. He was also literate and described in an eyewitness account as Angolan, as well as most of the other enslaved rebels. On the morning of September 9, 1739, Jemmy gathered 22 enslaved Africans near the Stono River, 20 miles or 30 kilometers southwest of Charleston. It was a Sunday, and usually on this day the planters would be at church and most likely be unarmed. just a month before the Security Act of 1739 passed, requiring all white males to carry arms even to church on Sundays. However, this law did not take full effect until 20 days after the revolt, as local officials decided they would penalize any white man who did not carry arms. Jemmy and his band marched down the roads holding a banner that read "Liberty," and they all chanted the word too. They attacked the Hutchinson's weapons store, decapitated the 2 shopkeepers, and stored their heads on the front. They also took the guns and ammunition. The rebels headed towards the south, burning the Godfrey plantation, where they killed 2 white planters. They went to a place called Wallace's Tavern, where they met the innkeeper. Because the innkeeper was kind to the slaves, his life was spared. However, the inhabitants of the next 6 houses or so were not spared. One white witness recalled that they killed all the white people they found in Pompon's Road. By noon, between 20 and 25 whites were killed, which made the Stono Rebellion the largest and bloodiest revolt of mainland British North America. As the enslaved rebels marched, they gained more followers and soon numbered to around 100 followers, men and women. They made more banners and beat on drums in military fashion. This alarmed Lieutenant Governor William Bull, who rushed to intercept the Africans near the Edisto River. In the meantime, they stopped by the river and played traditional war dances, sang songs in Portuguese, English, and Kikongo, and continued to beat their drums in hopes that more enslaved Africans would escape to them. Armed troops headed towards them around 4 in the afternoon. Usually in slave revolts, the mere sight of armed troops would cause escaped enslaved Africans to surrender. However, this did not happen. Instead, the slaves fired at them. Unfortunately, on return, Bull's men shot back and killed 14 rebels. At this point, many of the slaves who came later to join the band fled or surrendered. 23 whites under the command of William Bull were also killed. By dusk, 47 slaves were killed. Over the next month, most enslaved Africans that were part of the rebellion were captured, with the rest being captured in the following 6 months. Most were executed, although a few were sold to the markets of West Indies. Only one rebel remained a fugitive for 3 years. As news came out, the leaders of the slave revolt were reported to be Angolan. Colonists believed they had links to Spanish Florida, since they thought Portuguese was a dialect of Spanish, and the fact that many enslaved Africans were Catholic. One South Carolina planter complained that many thousands of the Negroes profess the Roman Catholic religion. There are no specific details on Jemmy's capture or when he died, but he was one of the slaves who were executed. The Security Act of 1739 came into full effect on September 29th, where whites would have to carry guns in church on Sundays. Anyone who did not comply with the new law by September 29th would be fined. The South Carolina government also made changes in the treatment of slaves and slave relations. For example, they passed the Negro Act of 1740, which criminalized assembly, the ability to read and write, and moving abroad for enslaved Africans. They were also prevented from growing any food and earning money. However, the legislature also worked to improve conditions in slavery to avoid future revolts. For example, penalties were established for any master who demanded excessive work or brutally punished slaves. But these laws were difficult to enforce, as testimonies made by slaves against whites were not recognized. A school was founded so that slaves could be taught Christian doctrine. However, the legislature made it harder to grant a slave manumission, which is the act of freeing slaves by their owners. The laws against manumission in South Carolina were maintained until slavery was abolished after the Civil War. Planters also decided to develop a slave population that was native-born, as in Africans who were born in America, because the planters believed that the workers would be happier if they grew up enslaved. For about 10 years they did this, closing the port to the international slave trade. When they opened it again, they imported slaves that were not from the Angolan and Congolese regions. On May 30th, 1974, the site where the slave revolt was thought to have begun was declared a National Historic Landmark. This was where the weapons store Hutchinson's warehouse was located. A South Carolina historic marker was also placed there. The marker's text reads, The Stono Rebellion, 1739. The Stono Rebellion, the largest slave insurrection in British North America, began nearby on September 9, 1739. About 20 Africans raided a store near Wallace Creek, a branch of the Stono River. Taking guns and other weapons, they killed 2 shopkeepers. The rebels marched south toward promised freedom in Spanish Florida, waving flags, beating drums, and shouting liberty. On the reverse side, it reads, the rebels were joined by 40 to 60 more. During their 15-mile march, they killed at least 20 whites, but spared others. The rebellion ended late that afternoon when the militia caught the rebels, killing at least 54 of them. Most who escaped were captured and executed. Any forced to join the rebels were released. The South Carolina Assembly soon enacted a harsh slave code in force until 1865. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it.